Hey Caleb, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. Good presentation. I
Oh,
was trying to
thanks.
follow. I admit that philosophy of mind is by no means my area. In fact, I had a friend he has a YouTube channel, and he had Josh Rasmussen on to talk about his new book on consciousness the other day,
Oh,
and I
nice.
was follow. So I think I getting better at it, but yeah, it's just not my area. But one thing that I did kind of come across about the hemispherectomy stuff and the identity stuff
Yeah.
was in the last presentation, but one thing that I've heard that I've thought about is like, I think it makes sense in terms of identity as a necessary property. It's at least possible I'm not identical to my body, therefore I'm not identical to my body. But do you think that identity is a kind of a complicated issue where sometimes there's areas where it's kind of gray, where it's not sure? Like one real life example is if you take a starfish and you cut it in half, each half grows back into a new starfish. So
hmm
like would we ask which one of them is the initial starfish? Did either one survive? Are they two different beings, or are they the same being, right? Or like a ship of Theseus example, right? Where you have
hmm
the ship and the woods being taken out. It's like, is it the same ship? Well, yeah, of course it is. How at what point does it become a different ship, right? So
Yeah.
uh with his like weird property of identity, do you think is it arbitrary in just language that we used for to get along in life, and that it's not something that actually exists, or is there something more metaphysical that can be defined with that?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So what I would say is first off, is we want to make a distinction between the epistemic question, how do we know, and the ontological question, what is it?
Right.
Sorry, that allergy's coming back. Had to mute. Anyway, so let's take the starfish example. So what we would want to say is, what do you mean by starfish? And I suspect you'll mean what you mean by starfish is the physical object, the collection of cells that is the starfish. Well,
Huh.
in that case, it's easy to see where the identity lies. Namely, they were both half of the original starfish that regrew a second half. So there isn't a continuity of identity beyond the continuity of part of it. Whereas with you and me, we seem to be one thing. Like there's a body that's of many things, but there's one perspective, one center of consciousness, and I want to know what is that? What is it that's having that center of consciousness? And
Huh.
so, when it comes to the hemispherectomy, that's in response to an ontological claim. The ontological claim is that you are your brain. So there, it's not an epistemic question of what are you, or when do you continue to exist. It's responding to a claim that what you are is your brain, and it's essentially saying that, well, okay, if we take that claim to be true, right? So we're now no longer asking what's identical. We're taking the identity claim as the given. Then this issue with the necessity of identity follows. That you would be both identical to your brain and possibly not identical to your brain. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, I think it does because it's more distinct there. What do you, because I'm assuming you think that higher level animals have consciousness of this kind, right? Do you think that like
Yeah,
apes and stuff have souls?
yeah.
What, so what,
Actually,
what,
so before I started my study, I thought that only humans had souls. I
yeah.
didn't believe that animals had souls. But in the study and looking at the philosophical arguments for the soul in humans, I came to believe that it must be the case that there's some soul, some immaterial substance that accounts for the unified perspective of the animals, and they have to have a unified perspective to run away from predators and field of view. They have the same field of view issues. So
Yeah, and what the question with that is what is like the minimal level of consciousness needed, right? Because I think we'd say, yeah, gorillas are conscious, bears are conscious, dogs. What about like, I mean, you probably wouldn't say an amoeba is conscious though, right? Or like maybe like what about a mosquito? Like at what point is there like an arbitrary cutoff in terms of now this is like the minimum we need for consciousness, or is it kind of hard to tell?
So again, that falls back on the epistemic question of when do we know that something's conscious?
Yeah.
And so it may be the case that the amoeba has a soul, and we just don't know it because we have no way of perceiving it. Much like if somebody was,
Like a
completely
panpsychist would say that everything has a soul, but it's not
right,
perceived.
yeah. But like if, for example, let's suppose that some sort of alien organism crash landed on the Earth, right? But it was unconscious. It never gained consciousness. And let's suppose its anatomy was such that it didn't seem to obviously have consciousness in order to exist. We would be left not knowing. We just wouldn't know whether it was conscious or not. That wouldn't mean that wouldn't actually settle or begin to answer the ontological question one way or the other as to whether or not it has a soul. So what I've heard from different discussions dealing with animal suffering is that human beings and the higher primates are self-aware, and that no other animal is actually self-aware. So, for example, a dog doesn't know that it exists; it doesn't know that you exist. It just has behavioristic responses to things. But they do have first-order awareness of pain, so like they'll feel the sensation of pain, but they won't be aware that they are a self that's in pain. That's hard to wrap your head around, but that. So, I suppose that would be a lower level of consciousness in the sense that we can think of those as distinct things. But then, animals are a wide range. Like is a fish at the same thing, place as a lower level primate or something. I have no idea.
Yeah, I know it's weird. Last thing I'll say. Well, I don't think anyone else is trying to get up, but I
Yeah.
don't know if I asked last time. I forget if I even asked last time, but what about like I think it's called the anchoring. I'm sure you know the interaction problem, right?
Yeah.
What about the like I think I've heard a term also called the anchoring problem, or the idea that if this is immaterial and like not spatial, how is it that it's inside a body? Like why can't I just astral project my soul outside my body anytime I want? Or like why am I stuck inside a physical thing if it's if it's a non-physical? Like how does that contain it? Or does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like,
and I'm really glad that you brought that up because that's actually one of the big objections that I failed to respond to in the presentation. So I'm really glad that you brought it up. So there's a couple of things going on there. First of all, is the interaction problem. If you are an immaterial soul, how is it the immaterial soul can interact with the material world? That's the first question. Then the second question is, okay, given that you're an immaterial soul, what does that mean? If you're immaterial, then how can you be in a body? And why do you remain attached to this body? Why is it if, for example, if you and I shake hands that I can't move your leg, right? Why is it that my soul can only interact with this body? So
we've all seen like Freaky Friday, though. It's like at least
yeah,
conceivably,
exactly, right?
right? So why isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And so let's look at the first question first. How is it the immaterial can interact with the physical? And this is gonna at first seem like a really unsatisfying response, but I think it's the only response we can give for any causation, and that is it just does. Now that sounds like a little too easy, right? It just does. But if you think about it, all causation is that way. So, for example, why is it that the proton repels the electron? And you'll probably say something like, well, this electromagnetic forces, right? Well, the electromagnetic forces just describe the force with which the proton repels the electron. But how is it that it does that? Like, why does it do that? And so you just ultimately say, well, it's the nature of the proton and the nature of the electron that they repel each other. In other words, that they just have this capacity to repel each other. They just do, is what it amounts to.
Say that with the nature of the soul. Actually, no, one way you could answer that question is by saying that instead of going to an arbitrary or just idea of brute necessity that it just does, you could appeal to something that is omnipotent, that has the ability to impute this causal power. So
that's not that what I said was not a brute fact. It's not a brute.
Yeah, I know it is. Well, it could theoretically be, but it's not. I know you're not.
Well,
You're
what
not
I've
saying.
said wasn't brute. So a brute fact is a fact for which there is no explanation. And so the causation of my
I meant a brute necessity. Sorry, let me be more specific.
a brute necessity.
Because a brute fact could be a brute contingency. I meant a brute necessity. A brute necessity is it's necessary, and that's just it. You can't go any further.
So again, it's not brute. So something that's brute is something that's true without any explanation for why it's true. But that's not what I'm positing at all, right? In order for the movement of your hand to be brute, there'd have to be literally no explanation. So not in the soul either, like no explanation. Your hand just moves. And so that's not at all what I'm positing. What I'm positing is that
Well,
your soul.
maybe I think that this is a semantic difference because
Okay.
I've asked my friends this before in terms of can is God a brute necessity or is he just necessary? Because it's like does brute mean there is no external reason? Like if something exists by the necessity of its own nature, which I think you and I would say God does, is it a brute necessity or is it just would you just not throw the word brute in at all?
Yeah, it's not brute. It's not brute at all.
So brute necessity just doesn't is not even a thing.
I don't think
Just
anything's brute.
well, would you don't think that free will is that certain
No.
free act libertarian free will actions are
I
brute?
I explain my actions. I'm the explanation for my actions. So if I perform action X, I'm the explanation of my performing action X. It's not
But why did you
inexplicable. You
perform
couldn't have the action without me.
But why did you perform action X?
It's within it's the sort of being that I am to have the capacity. Why did I
Exactly.
do it? That's a
And
question about my.
why is it the sort of being that you are?
Well, that's not a brute question. That's an analytical question. So
Yeah.
it's like, why
Well,
is
it's
water
just
wet? It's not just brute that water's wet. That's just what it is. Is it's water's wet. Why is water H2O?
that's a tautology. It's not a bruteness, but
Okay, well then your question is a tautology. Why is it that the
well,
soul
I
has?
know I did it, but okay. But do you think that you could? Okay, I don't want to get too off that, but well, no one else is their hand raised. That's fine. It's relatively on topic. It's, with the soul, right? No, the question though is like, okay, if you can choose between A and B, and you legitimately free choice, wouldn't wouldn't the idea of you are who you are, and that's why explain both A or B? So if I said why did he choose A over B, like I don't know if it's equally probable you could have done either or. I feel like that's I wouldn't say it's brute. I would say that it's entailed in your freedom, and I can explain your freedom by positing God or your soul. So it's not like a complete mystery. I can at least say, well, he has the properties to where he's able to do this freely. But if I was able to explain why you chose A over B, then it wouldn't be libertarian freedom. It would be a probably like a compatibilist view at that point because I'd be able
No.
to give an external explanation to explain it.
So I think the problem there is what you seem to be relying on is the notion that events have to be caused by events.
No,
It
I know agent versus event causation. That's not what I'm talking
okay.
about like a PAP, like a principle of alternative possibilities, where if
Well,
you could have done otherwise, if we can explain why you would have done otherwise, then it would that kind of negates the whole point.
all right. If it's all right with you, I'm going to go ahead and I'll kind of like give my response to it, and then you
Yeah,
can let me know
that's
what you
fine.
think.
Yeah, that's fine. Go.
And
I was
so
just clarifying.
sure, okay. And so basically, I'm choosing between A and B, and this comes down to again like the original question is how is it the immaterial can cause physical actions, and the answer is it just does. That's a thing that it does, right? And so it has the power, it has the potential to cause physical actions. And then you suggested that was brute, and my response was, well, it's not brute because the action is explained in the object. If you want to ask why does that object have that power, well, then that's like a creative question, right? So that would go back to, it inherited it from its parents, or I inherited my causal powers from my parents because I inherited everything that I am from my parents. And then you go on back to creation, I suppose, and then God is the explanation of creation. But that's not really the question. I think that you were then later getting into is a question surrounding free will. And so the first response, I guess, would say that you can come down on either side of free will, and nothing about my presentation required you to believe in free will. Somebody could be a determinist and still believe that you are a soul for the reasons that I've laid out. But setting that aside, let's say my choice of A versus my choice of B. Well, my choice of A is explained in me. I chose A. And so it's not unexplained, which would be brute. It's explained in terms of me. And you say, well, why did you choose A rather than B? Well, now you're asking not so much why did I choose A, but you're asking what my reasons were for choosing A over B. And perhaps I liked it more, perhaps it was a whim, whatever. It doesn't matter. That's more a question about whether it's arbitrary, because you're no longer looking for an explanation of why I chose A. The explanation for why I chose A is found in me, the agent who chose A. The explanation of why I preferred one option over the other is now quite a question of arbitrariness, not a question of explanation of the choice itself, in the sense that we're talking about. So that's kind of why I don't take that to be brute at all, because it is explained in terms of something, and the thing that it's in terms of is me.
So you don't. Well, okay, that's fair.
Thank you for listening. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe. Please also look at the show notes in order to find a link to our group so that you can join our next discussion. I look forward to chatting with you.